Okay, so where we left off, we had the leaf applied, the leaf texture applied to our object, and we need to get rid of this white boundary on the leaf. So we're going to be doing this through materials and specifically using the opacity channel in order to do that. So let's go ahead and open our material. Now you'll note I have a couple other materials here, and that's because I've done this tutorial several times. As I mentioned, the things have not been going well on my computer side, and I've been having technical issues, alas. Okay, so we've got our texture running into our color channel. What we need to do is we want to use this same texture to create a mask that's going to be an opacity mask for our leaf. And in order to do a mask on the opacity channel, the opacity works by colors that are black, 100% black, are going to be completely transparent, and colors that are 100% white will be completely opaque. Anything in between there is going to be some variation of opacity, and it will also be based on the color, right? So you'll see what I mean by that as soon as we do this next step. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to want to invert this color first. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and double click in the empty space and just type invert, or INV, not INT, but INV, there we go. And color invert will be my first choice. I'm going to double click on that. I'm going to route the output of this into the input of my color invert. Now, once I've done that, if I click on this preview button here, or the solo button, you'll see that now I have this black outline and this beautiful magenta-y pink inside, right? Because I've inverted the color channel information in my leaf. If I go ahead and connect this to my opacity node on my standard material, and then turn off solo, you'll see that now I actually have transparency, right? I have the opacity of my leaf is gone. Now, one of the things you're going to note is that if you look closely at this, there's these areas where it's a little bit more hazy and areas where the color is more vibrant. And that's telling me that some of these pinks are showing through, and this isn't 100% opaque. Now, it will, I can tell you from experience that if I was to put this in render view and rotate it around, we're actually not going to be seeing light through this at this point because it's too shallow of a color. We are getting some opacity there, but it does impact the final color of our object. So if we go ahead and I'm just going to open it up in a floating window because we're only going to look at it for a second. I'm going to go ahead and hit render on this. You'll see in Redshift render view, right, I'm actually getting some of the pink through here in this render, and that's not what we want, right? We don't want that color to be bleeding through. So we need to make some additional changes. So I'm going to stop this and double check, make sure, yes, I still have things rendering. Fantastic. And I can actually record video. Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to tweak this. We basically want to make this more of a threshold, right? We want this to be filled in with white and not to have all of this color in here. Now, just doing this with nodes, we're not going, at least with this leaf and this image, we're not going to get this perfect. But again, this is meant to be something that's more of a background thing, right? It's something you're trying to spend not a huge amount of time doing. And so we're going to try and work quickly and just use nodes. If we really wanted to do this right, we would go into Photoshop and we would do the invert there. We'd probably do some thresholding, some color balance. And then when we got it really close, we could select anything that's still pink purplish and just delete it, right? Which is a great way to work if you've got access. If you don't have access to that software, then this will get you close enough for this. And it also shows you how to do a lot of cool stuff in Cinema. Okay, so we've got our color invert. Let's go ahead, and now we need to do some color correction. So we're going to double click, and we could either search for it or we could just click on color and then go to color correct and double click. And now what we want to do is we want to take our output color, drop it into our input. Make sure we're still recording. Fantastic. Okay, so we've got this input. And in these settings, the biggest one we want to change to start with is going to be our saturation scale, right? Let's just start by pulling this down to 0. And when we do that, you can see we're already getting a much better result in our preview. Let's go ahead and solo this on our object, and we can kind of see what's happening. I don't quite understand why that's looking pink there. Let's go ahead and see what it looks like in our render view when we solo it. Okay. So there's some issue where this isn't updating correctly. That's fine. But you can see now it's black and white, right? And it's actually a lot less, a lot more subtle than it was before. Now this might be functional. So let's go ahead and bring this into our opacity channel. And maybe now that will, now that preview just doesn't want to update. Maybe if I go to view and redraw, we can see that. Or view, it does say uses, no. Yeah, redrawing it doesn't help. It just doesn't seem to care what I do right now. So we'll just use render view. Okay, so we've got that set. I'm going to unsolo this and see what our leaf looks like, right? At this point, it looks a lot better. This might be acceptable as it stands. However, if you notice it causing trouble or you get further along and your leaf doesn't quite look right, you can blast these settings, right? We can, if we decrease our gamma, we're going to actually get more transparency. We're going to be looking through the leaf more where the veins are, right? If we increase our gamma, that's going to slowly kind of eradicate the dark gray areas inside the leaf. However, especially if I go to this, you'll see that right now I'm starting to get this like hazy halo around the edge of the leaf here, and that's not really what we want. And so we can reduce that by increasing our contrast, right? And so I could boost the contrast up a fair amount, and you'll see, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so we can maybe see in our render view just a little bit closer to this edge. Right? If this is something that's really close to the camera, right, we're going to want to do a slightly better job, especially with, like, we'd really want to go into Photoshop or another imaging editing program and clean up the edges. Because no matter what, we're going to have a little bit of a white halo here with the current image, just using this default image. And it'd be really better if we went through and shrunk our selection area a little bit and tightened it up on there. But I'm trying to show how to do this as a quick, least amount of effort way that we can do it for a background asset. Okay, so I've shrunk that down. I basically got rid of all of the transparent areas in the center. And if you want to check, right, currently my gamma's at 2.54 and my contrast is 0.75, right? If I run this and I see that there is some haloing still happening, I can always like increase my contrast a bit more, right? Now, when I get really up there to the end, and actually I'm just going to leave it at 1. It looks really clean here, but there may be some noise and speckles outside the leaf. And that's just something that, again, if we're far enough away from it, nobody's going to see. Okay, so I've got that set. So let's go ahead and unsolo this. And at least against this black background, we've got a pretty good result. You can see a thin white halo, which is to be expected, as I said, given the asset that we're using. And that's something, again, right, a little bit tighter selection area in Photoshop we could clean up really nicely. Okay, so I'm actually pretty happy with that result as it stands. So we're going to go ahead and save this currently. I'm going to make sure I am still recording. Fantastic. Okay, so we've saved this. I don't know why it's deciding to update everything. I'm going to go ahead and pause our render view real quick. And so now we need to do our next step. And our next step is going to be to make it so that we actually can have light shine on this surface and be able to see the light essentially glowing through the leaf on the other side. So I'm going to close Redshift for a little bit. I'm going to close my node editor for a second as well. And we need to add a light to the scene. So I'm going to go ahead and put an area light in to start with. And right by default, it's kind of centered right in the middle of this leaf. I actually am going to want to lift this up and rotate it a few degrees, right? It doesn't matter exactly where we put this, as long as it's right more or less aimed down, not at a perfect 90-degree angle, but aim down at the surface of our leaf. Okay, so we've got that set. One thing I did forget to mention was our bump, right? Right now, there is no bump right on our leaf. It's a really flat texture. You can kind of see, again, there's like a little bit of haziness in that preview, but we're not seeing any poor results from that yet. If we do, we can fix that by continuing to adjust our settings here. Okay, so let's go ahead and add some bump. So for bump, we are going to want to double click, create a bump map, drop that in. We want the bump map output to be connected to our bump map. And the input, we could potentially go ahead and it works pretty well to just go ahead and use our output color. Because we've trimmed off most of this edge, we shouldn't have too much of like a lift artifact on the sides. But let's see how this looks within render view real quick. Okay, so let's go ahead and view this, right? So you can see that, right, we definitely have a lot more texture on the surface of this leaf. Honestly, it looks like the leaf's upside down. So maybe we want to invert the color channel before we run this through here. We could try that real quick and see what that result looks like. So let's go ahead and take our color invert and actually feed this out from the invert to the input and see if that looks a little bit different. I'm going to refresh this here just to make sure. It looks pretty similar to me, but whatever the case, it really is going to depend on your camera angle and again, how close this is, right? The bump isn't going to make a huge difference to the entire image, but if I rotate this down, we can kind of see, let's see what happens if I switch it back. Let's see if we notice any difference whatsoever in this bump. Right? I'm not seeing a whole lot of difference. The only other thing we might want to check is what type of bump map we're using. Currently, we have it set to height field. We could also switch this to tangent space normal, right? And again, not a whole lot of change, although it looks, honestly, it looks pretty nice that way. We could also try object space normal. And object space normal is probably the most accurate, just because it is the object that we're using. And I'm going to go ahead and keep it there. And granted, we're kind of messing with things. We're throwing like just a green leaf into here, but as long as there's some tonal variation for something that's in the background, it's going to look better than it did previously. Okay. So we've done that. So let's go ahead and start to get our backlighting set up. So the way that you do backlighting in Redshift is we're going to use Subsurface, which I've talked about in a previous tutorial, but there's one checkbox that we need to check in order to make this right. So if I select my Redshift standard object, and I go down, there's Subsurfaces up here, and it's closed up by default, and it tends to close on its own for some reason, whenever you don't want it to. The weight is currently set to 0, the color is set to white. Right? If I increase this weight to 100%, you're going to notice that the whole top of the leaf that's being illuminated turns white. And if I was to rotate my view here so I'm below the leaf, and actually what I'm going to try and do is show some of the top of the leaf and some of the bottom of the leaf so we can really see what's happening. Right, so I'm seeing all of this as vibrantly white right now. And if I was to go and then adjust my subsurface, let me find it, back down to 0, right, I actually don't see the bottom of the leaf at all, right? This is totally opaque, and I can only see the top surface. So what's happening here? So what's happening is that the weight of the subsurface category is computed against the weight of the base. And if I crank the weight of the subsurface all the way to 1, it's going to essentially overwrite whatever the base channel is doing. So I need to find a balance in between where it's going to be showing me both. Now, a good starting place is somewhere around the middle, right? And you can tell in this case, that's still too much, right? I need to pull, if I pull this down even more, you can see that I'm getting a little bit of a mix here, but there's definitely still some problematic areas, and I'm still getting a little bit of a variation between those two that I'm not liking. So the first thing I need to do is actually use the correct color information for the bottom of this leaf. So to do that, I am going to, what I want to do is I want to connect the texture node to the color section of my subsurface channel. The easiest way to do that is to hover over this dot next to color, click and say connect node, existing nodes, and texture. And when I do that, now I'm going to be getting that blending of the two nodes. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want you to note this is taking forever to render. And that's because it's currently trying to compute this like a normal subsurface, like subsurface would for an object that has thickness. But we're doing something that's a very thin single layer of polygons. And so what we need to do is down here under geometry, we need to check mark thin walled. As soon as we check mark thin walled, our render time should decrease pretty substantially. And then what we need to do is, now that we've got these a bit more well blended, we can adjust this weight until we're happy with the result. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up a little bit, and you'll notice as I pull this up, it's going to start brightening what's happening on the bottom of the leaf, right? If I crank it all the way to the top, right, that's not going to really work out, right? Because then all of that color information from the light that hits this surface and bounces to the camera is going to be gone, although it's really vibrant down here. So let's go ahead and find someplace in the middle. I've actually found that, you know, for this file, somewhere a little bit lower than half seems to be the better result. And obviously it's going to depend on, you know, where is my camera? What am I trying? Am I trying to get more of the bottom of the leaf, more of the top of the leaf? How's that going? Now, the other thing is that rarely does the light hitting the top surface of the leaf look identical to the light that's transmitting through the leaf. And so what you can do is we can basically create a tint, use a couple nodes to tint the bottom side of the leaf so that we have a different color result. And so to do that, what we're going to do is we are going to double click in our texture nodes, and we are going to go ahead and look for just a color node. And what the color node does, right, is it lets us define any color we want and then use that as an input for something else. So I'm going to set this color to be more of a yellowish green, and I'm going to crank my saturation and my vibrance up. I'm just going to go like real ugly with it. And then what we need to do is we need to mix that or blend that or composite that with our leaf. So we still get all that texture, but we're going to be using this as like a tint. So I'm going to double click, I'm going to go to color, and I'm going to go to color composite. And then I'm going to use the leaf as my base color, and I'm going to use the color as my blend color. Once I've done that, if I go ahead and click on the solo mode, so I am just soloing the color that I'm working on here, you can see that right now the composite mode is base color, which means it's just the leaf showing through. If I change this to blend color, then it's just going to be the blend color, surprisingly enough. If I change this to average, right, it's going to be both of those together evenly. And then you'll notice there's all the different settings we can do, the different ways we can blend. I have found for this tutorial, soft light seems to be the most effective. And then if I want to, I can go to my color and I can maybe pull the vibrance down just a touch. Right, to make it a little bit richer in color on that bottom side. Or I could potentially, do this. I can't remember if this is going to wash it out too much if we just dial this down a bit, if it makes it more white. Let's see what it does. Yeah, that doesn't seem to have much of an effect at all on the color. This is the most intensely changing variable for this. And so I'm going to leave it somewhere around 80% vibrance. And now what I need to do is go ahead and instead of having this color goes straight to the subsurface. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this down. I'm going to hover over here. You'll see it says no, but then it pops open subsurface and I can connect to the color node. So now that I've done that, I'll turn solo off on this node. And you can see that there's like a subtle difference. And you could make this more dramatic if you want, but there's a subtle difference between what if I zoom out a bit here and rotate down here, right? There's a subtle difference between that color tone and this color tone, right? And maybe I can make it more absurd in terms of the brightness here. I can just blast that all the way up. The other thing is, if it's still not obvious, right, I could always go and maybe say add instead, which is right, really bright. And then when I rotate this down, you can definitely see the difference between those two, right? If I do add, right, I can always go to this color and I can, again, either adjust, generally the vibrance is the one that's going to like make it less intense in this case. I do want you to note the alpha doesn't really seem to do anything to the image in this case, probably because it's not using all 4 channels for the other node. Okay, so sometimes you try and do a tutorial and the world just hates you. Cinema just crashed as I was sliding a slider to adjust one of these settings. Okay, so let's hope that this all works. All right, great. We've got our leaf. And we can see things on the bottom and the top, which is the point of this tutorial. There's another couple steps I just wanted to show you as additional things, but Cinema was unhappy with that idea. Okay, so I'd say we're in a pretty good state. You can see the light coming through the bottom surface, going through the top. But let's see what happens now when we actually start stacking a couple leaves and maybe using a spotlight and some other things instead. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this rendering, close this, and close this because we are done with that material. You should save the file if you haven't, because there's no telling when it's going to crash. All right, so to start with, I'm going to go ahead and select my leaf, which is just this polygon. I'm going to copy it, I'm going to paste it, hit the letter E on the keyboard so I can lift this up. I'm going to move it around a little bit, I'm going to lift it, and then I'm going to go ahead and rotate it. And right, it's still, the axis is still kind of aligned with the center, so I'm going to have to move it a little bit in order to get it to align back where I want it to be, right? Imagining they're coming off the same stalk or plant or something like that. So I've got 2 of them there, and then let's go ahead and copy this one. I can just hold down Control, click and drag to create another copy here. And I'm going to give this a reasonable amount of space. I'm going to rotate this back the other direction a little bit, hit the letter E, and scoot this over. The goal with all of this being that we have these overlaid. Now, right, I could potentially adjust the bend deformer on each of these in order to, right, create a different shape, but I'm going to leave them all the same now because we don't need to worry about that for this tutorial. I'm going to save this real quick. Yes. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab my area light, and I want to lift this up a little bit more. I'm going to pull it over so it's a little bit more centered over the leaves. And let's go ahead and take a look in render view and see what we see right now. So I'm going to go ahead and just open this up in the side. And you can see I've got my 3 leaves. And oops, it does that every time. And if I rotate this around, right, you can see that I'm actually getting light to pass through the top leaf. And you can see the color of that top leaf is actually impacting how light passes through the second leaf. And there is some light passing through the bottom leaf, but most of it has been blocked. And you can also kind of see this little shadowed edge here on the leaf as it's kind of transitioning between the two. So let's go ahead and stop this for a second. And then I'm going to add a spotlight. And I'm just going to go ahead and drop my spotlight in my scene. I'm going to pull this over so you can see what I'm doing, but right, instead of manually repositioning this light, I just basically want it to be where the area light is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my area light. I'm going to go to coordinates. I'm going to click on the P, and then I'm going to hold down Shift and click on the R, right click and go to copy. Then if I go over to my spotlight, these settings should still be up for my spot now. And I can just right click on either the R or the P and go to paste identical. And what that will do is it's going to jump this up into the same spot. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off my area light. I'm actually going to drag it up here so it's next to my other light. And as soon as I do that, if I go to render this again, it's going to be very dark, right? And that's because the spotlight needs some additional exposure. So I'm going to boost this up a fair amount just to, really get that to glow to shine through there. And then I can tell already that I need to adjust it a little bit. So I'm going to turn this off. Oop. Every single time. Rotate my view. I don't know why I do that so continuously. And I might pull this back just a little bit and scoot this down a little bit more. There we go. Because what I want to show you is just kind of what this looks like with this light set here. And so let's go ahead and render this again. Right, okay, so you can see if I don't move the light, if I move the leaves and the whole scene, there we go, if I move the camera, right, you can kind of see that I'm getting some hard edges on these leaves, some shadows from the leaf above it. I might pull this, is that the wrong direction? Yeah, let's see here. I'm going to pull this over here a little bit. There we go. Right, so now you can see the different shadows that I'm getting from this leaf. And you can see that this shadow isn't quite as dark, right, as it could be, and it's actually more shadowed further under there. And that's in part because of the shaders that we've put on our materials. So if I go ahead and rotate under here now, right, you can see that the backlight is actually casting different shadows. There's a lot of things happening here that are really pretty nice, and it gives it a very, a pretty magical effect. Like it looks like light is hitting the top of this leaf and illuminating through it. Okay, so that's the end of this tutorial. You can obviously put more of a scene light in here. We could always throw a sun and sky rig in and maybe try and re-render this. Although I don't know why the sun and sky rig decided not to render a background at all, but that's odd. Oh, we're just like really low in the scene. But you can see, right, with that sun and sky rig, even with that, we're getting right the light from there, but we're also getting a lot of light passing through from the sky. And this can create a really nice, right, a really nice scene. And our background is totally black right now. Okay, that's the tutorial.